Okay. Hello and welcome, everyone. Wonderful to see all of you here from around the world, from Japan to Canada, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, everywhere, Pakistan.
And the United States, don't forget.
And the United States, yes, I'm in Boston myself. I would like to ask everyone to please keep their mics on mute as we get started. And just to, this is our 14th, I think, seminar or web discussion from the Southasia Peace Action Network platform. And the title of it, Vishal, if you could just put it up on the screen, which is Beyond Partitions, and we are kind of shared histories, ways forward. And this title comes from the concept that we have to look back to look forward, which is a concept that I first sort of started thinking about when we produced a documentary on the student movement my father led in the 1950s in Pakistan. And we had a very big event in Karachi, and Eric Cyprian in Glasgow suggested calling it looking back to look forward, because I was like, what's the point of like delving into history? And he said, we have to look at history to look forward. So I'm just, like I said, I'm very excited to have all of you here. This is our 14th event beyond our 14th web discussion. And we are thrilled to have a really wonderful lineup of speakers. And before we go forward with the program itself, we start with the founding charter of the Southasia Peace Action Network, which, as most of you know, began in March 2021 as a cross-border, cross-diasporic, intergenerational entity. It's a coalition. And we have, we are really honored to have Rafiq Katwari, who's an award-winning Kashmiri poet based in New York, to present the founding charter to us. Kanak Dixit from Nepal was going to originally do this, and Rafiq was kind enough to step in at the last minute, and he's one of our earliest and strongest supporters. And also because Kashmir, I think it's actually really appropriate, it just happened that way, given how essential Kashmir is to this whole issue, because we're talking about a regional, the whole concept of regionalism. It's not just India, Pakistan, because where the knot of Kashmir on the northwest sort of is holding up in a way everything. But it's not just India, Pakistan, it's not just Kashmir, and yet that region does hold the key in a way. So Rafiq, if we could have you on spotlight. Vishal, are you doing the spotlighting and then the founding charter? So I can actually do that as well. Spotlight Rafiq for everyone. So there's Rafiq, and hello Rafiq, good morning to you in New York, and we are just absolutely honored to have you here. So I'm going to now stop talking and hand it over to you.
Thanks, Beena. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Yes.
All right, very good. It's a privilege to be here, and glad to be stepping in for the gentleman who couldn't make it. So I'm going to go through the founding charter and listen up. Sapan is a coalition of individuals and representatives, or as we say in Kashmir, representatives, of various organizations joining hands for a minimum common agenda, reclaiming South Asia. In doing so, we reiterate our commitment to take forward the principles and ideals of peace, justice, democracy, and human rights articulated by visionaries like Dr. Mubashir Hassan, Nikhil Chakravarti, Asma Jahangir, Nirmala Deshpande, Kuldeep Nair, Rajni Kothari, among others. A visa-free South Asia or confederation of nations with soft borders, a region in which each nation ensures quality education, justice, and freedom of expression and religion to its own citizens, as well as support and solidarity to those of the other nations. We aim to reclaim South Asia. To quote another of our mentors and visionaries, the late I.A. Rahman, we support the objectives of SAARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. Quote, to promote the welfare of the peoples of South Asia and to improve their quality of life, to accelerate economic growth, social progress, and cultural development in the region, and to provide all individuals the opportunity to live in dignity and to realize their full potential, to promote and strengthen collective self-reliance among the countries of South Asia, to contribute to mutual trust, understanding, and appreciation of one another's problems, to promote active collaboration and mutual assistance in the economic, social, cultural, technical, and scientific fields, to strengthen cooperation with other developing countries, to strengthen cooperation among themselves in international forums on matters of common interests, and to cooperate with international and regional organizations with similar aims and purposes, unquote. The South Asia Action Network, therefore, calls on the governments and peoples of South Asian nations to work towards, number one, instituting soft borders and visa-free South Asia, or visa on arrival, to allow freedom of trade and travel to each other's citizens. Two, ensure human rights and dignity for all their citizens, including religious and ethnic minorities, women, children, and other oppressed communities. And three, cooperate in all areas, particularly related to public health, culture, and legal reform, education, environment, climate change, water issues, disarmament, demilitarization, and denuclearization. So that's the charter, unless you want me to go to read the endorsing organizations, which are 31 in number. Would you like me to do that, or would you like me to?
No, that's fine. I think people can go to the link. We can go to the link, and people can, there's also, if you can scroll up, back up, Priyanka, and show the people, if you go to the website, www.southasiapeace.com, the founding charter is right there on the homepage, and you can click on a link, and we have it in various languages. So if anybody hasn't endorsed it already, please feel free to do so, and to also endorse it institutionally. And Rafiq, is there anything else you'd like to?
No, it's been a privilege being here, and I am looking forward to making whatever order the boss lady gives me, and I will do my best to complete it.
No, there's no boss lady here. We're all working together. Thank you again so much, Rafiq, for stepping in at such short notice. We're really privileged and honored to have you on our platform and to support us here. I'm going to now hand it over. We're going to continue with another tradition we've been doing since the start of every single event that we have had. We start with an in memoriam section in which we honor the people whose vision we are taking forward, and whose vision we are taking forward, and whose work we are building on. And to present the charter, we have two absolutely amazing, wonderful friends here, Dr. Fauzia Diba, who is from Quetta and currently in New Jersey, and Namrata Sharma from Nepal, a senior journalist from Nepal, who I got to know through the South Asia Women in Media Network, a wonderful network that we are both part of, the SOM sisters, as we call it. So Namrata and Fauzia will present the in memoriam. and I will hand it over to them to do so.
Thank you. Thank you, Bina. Dear friends, this is the most somber part of Sapan's monthly events, as we start our events by remembering those South Asian figures who made their mark in life and who left us forever since our last meeting. Before naming those individuals, let us keep in our thoughts the thousands of flood victims in Pakistan who are still hit by morbidity and mortality due to hunger, disease, and harsh winters. I thank Sapan member Vishal for preparing this presentation that Namrata Sharma and I will present together. We now pay homage to the intellectuals and reformers who were beacons of social justice in South Asia, who Sapan members feel proud to call our torchbearers, but who are no more with us. They are Dr. Mubashir Hassan, Kuldeep Nayyar, Kamla Bhasin, Asma Jahangir, Ayer Rahman, Nirmala Deshpande, Sufia Kamal, Sania Hussain, Rubina Saigal, Sabine Mahmood, Dr. Saman Kaligama, Dr. Iqbal Ahmed, Praful Bidwai, and Rajni Kothari. Next slide, please. Your audio.
Toab Khan, senior journalist in Dhaka, advisory editor of the Bengali daily Janakantha, also worked for Dainik Sangbad and Dainik Pakistan, and was press secretary to late Prime Minister of Bangladesh, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. He was also awarded Ekushe Padak in 2016 by the government of Bangladesh, died on 1st October 2022 due to old age-related complications at the age of 88.
Darshan Dharmaraj was an actor in film, theatre, and television based in Colombo. He was awarded Best Actor awards at several film festivals in Sri Lanka, died at age only 41 from a heart attack on 2nd October 2022.
Arun Bali, veteran actor born in Lahore, December 1942, worked in numerous films and television series, died in Mumbai on 7th October 2022 at age 79.
Temsula Au, a Naga poet, fiction writer, and ethnographer based in Dimapur, Nagaland. In 2013, she was also appointed as chairperson of the Nagaland State Commission for Women. As the chairperson, she was very vocal for women's rights in the state, often challenging traditional status quo, was awarded the Padma Shri Award for her contribution to literature and education in 2007. On October 9, she passed away at the age of 80.
Muhammad Masoom Aziz. He was a stage, film, and television actor based in Dhaka and played in more than 400 dramas and films since 1985. In 2022, he was awarded the Ekushe Padak for his contribution to acting by the government of Bangladesh. Died on 17 October 2022 due to heart-related complications. He was 70.
Also dying on 17th October 2022 was Syed Yusuf Halim. He was an Afghan judge and served as Chief Justice of Afghanistan from 2014 to 2021. He passed away due to cardiac problem at the age of 62.
Arshad Sharif was a journalist, writer, and television news anchor based in Karachi. He specialized in investigative journalism. Sharif was shot dead by local police in Kenya on 23 October 2022. Investigations are ongoing in the matter, described by the Kenyan police as a case of mistaken identity.
Next, please. Ila Ramesh Bhatt was an Ahmedabad-based cooperative organizer, activist, and a Gandhian who founded the Self-Employed Women's Association of India, SEWA, in 1972 and served as its general secretary till 1996. She was awarded the Raman Magsaysay Award in 1977, Right Livelihood Award in 1984, and Padma Bhushan in 1986. She passed away on 2nd of November at the age of 89 after a brief illness.
Saroj Raj Adhikari, a Kathmandu-based journalist and author, worked for several Nepali media outlets, including Kantipur Daily, found dead under mysterious circumstances in a hotel room in Kathmandu on 9th November 2022.
Ghulam Mustafa was a dance artist based in Dhaka. He was awarded the Shilpakala Padak in 2016 and the Ekushe Padak in 2020 by the government of Bangladesh. He died in Dhaka on 13th November 2022 at the age of 82 after suffering from pneumonia and health problems due to old age.
Krishna was an actor, director, and producer based in Hyderabad, Telangana, known for his works predominantly in Telugu cinema. He is the father of popular actor Mahesh Babu. He was also honored with the Padma Bhushan for his contributions to Telugu cinema in 2009, died on 15th November 22 due to cardiac arrest at the age of 82.
Ali Imam was a Dhaka-based children's writer and audiovisual organizer who wrote many scientific and travel stories for children. He was awarded Bangla Academy Literary Award in 2001 in juvenile literature. He died at the age of 71 while undergoing treatment at a hospital in Dhaka on 21st November 22.
Abhay Natarajan, Chennai-based Indian scholar and educationist, Vice Chancellor of Thanjavur Tamil University, awarded the Padma Shri by the Government of India for his contribution towards Tamil language and culture, 2011, passed away on 21st November, aged 85.
Ismail Tara, actor and comedian born in Lahore, Ismail Tara worked in many stage plays, television, Urdu films. He won Nigar Awards 5 times consecutively. He got popular for his work in 50-50, a program aired on Pakistan television in the 1980s. Hence, he was my favorite as well as my children's. He died in Karachi at the age of 73 on 24th November, just a few days ago, due to kidney failure.
Oh. Mm.
So a lot of people left us last few months.
Thank you, Fauzia. Thank you, Namrata, for sharing this moving in memoriam presentation, and Vishal for putting it together. I will now call upon our good friend, a founding member of Sapan, Priyanka Singh, who has been in Delhi and is now in Cambridge, at the University of Cambridge in UK, doing her MPhil. And Priyanka will be moderating the upcoming discussion and introducing the speakers. Where is she?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Hi, Priyanka.
Hi.
And I will let you take it from here.
Sure. Thank you. So delighted to be here moderating this discussion and hoping it will be an enriching conversations. We have with us today Ananya Jahanara Kabir, Professor of English Literature at King's College London, winner of Infosys Prize in Humanities, also having authored prominent works on partition, including Partitions, Post-Amnesias, and Territory of Desire, which is on Kashmir. We also have with us Anam Zakaria, Toronto-based oral historian and author of 1971, A People's History from Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India, having also authored Between the Great Divide, A Journey into Pakistan-Administered Kashmir, and the Footprint of Partition, Narratives of 4 Generations of Pakistanis and Indians. We also have with us Anshul Malhotra, who's a Delhi-based writer and oral historian, co-founder of the Museum of Material Memory and author of Remnants of Separation, and In the Language of Remembering on the Generational Impact of the 1947 Partition. So with this amazing panel today, we'll begin the discussion. And to just set the context, the title for our discussion today is Beyond Partitions, Shared Histories, Ways Forward. So to begin with, as I invite Ananya, Anam, and Anshul to share their thoughts, I'd wish if you could think a little about the title itself, and maybe we can, through the conversation, also unpack the different elements within this, within the the subject of a conversation today. So when we look at this year, for example, marking 75 years since 1947, the year previously marked 50 years since 1971, two events which have, they have shaped and they continue to shape the ways in which we interact across South Asia in so many ways. And yet these are not, even though they are looked upon as these, grand historical events, they're not just those, they're not confined singularly to a time or space in time, or time or space for that matter. They, even in terms of, for example, whether it was about people moving, those movements continued to happen well after those particular events. Those particular events have continued to shape our interactions. So in that sense, they've been more of processes than events, and also in the ways in which these events and the the sort of the time thereafter gets viewed across South Asia so differently. So for example, 1947, if you look at it, right, so it is formation of Pakistan, but it also is looked at as partition or Batwara in India. For Bangladesh, 1971 brings with the War of Liberation, 1971 is sort of commemorated with the idea of liberation or Azad. But 1971 is viewed very differently in Pakistan, and also the way India, pictures itself in the whole narrative on 1971. So how all of, how the idea of partitions and these events itself is viewed very differently, that, and also how you sort of, came to work on this, for example, and this is something that, I think you have also addressed in your works. So Anshul, you've talked about your own personal connection to the events with your, family history, but you begin with 1947, and then in your works, you also then are expounding upon, the events of 1971 and how, there are interlinkages in between, how there are sort of stories of people where migrations keep on going on until the 1990s, for that matter. Anam, you've also discussed about, you've discussed about your visit to Bangladesh as well. You've discussed about how difficult that engagement begins when, there are those suspicions back in Pakistan as well and in Bangladesh, and how you sort of are navigating that. And Ananya, for you like your work on the sort of partitions, post-amnesias, which is such an intricate, intimate history of the entire of the period. So there's 1947, which happened, of course, much earlier. But when 1971 happened, you were a year old, and you've sort of detailed, how the intimate histories get woven, how families get into the picture. So if you could talk a little about the idea of partitions itself, and also how your work came in, how you came to work on it, and how your journey has been in this, so far. So I'll begin. I'd like to invite Ananya, followed by Anam, and then Anshul, and then we can, take the conversation forward from there.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Can you hear me, everybody?
Yes.
Am I? Fantastic. So thanks again to the whole assortment, the battery that has brought us together. And, it's been quite an intricate process too, of different groups and individuals working and liaising. I really must thank everyone for giving us this opportunity to speak together, maybe one day in person. That would be marvelous. You've asked a very fundamental question, Priyanka, and, you've already given a hint in how I tried to respond to it in my book. But the book came at the end of a series of rethinking of myself as an academic, as a person. I was not trained at all in South Asian studies. I was doing my PhD in Cambridge in medieval English literature, and that was when the 50th year, commemoration, the first, I think, big year where people sat up and thought there is something which we must talk publicly about, which is partition. because it was the 50th year. And I was, I was very, sort of like, I was very struck. I was totally immersed in my PhD work, and you know how PhDs are, they don't really give you time to think about anything else. However, even within that kind of cocoon, this commemorative energy was kind of, penetrating that cocoon and making me restless about what was I doing with my life? What was I doing with my training as a literary critic? Am I, was I just meant to, look, I was kind of intellectually very inspired by the work I was doing. It was like a puzzle I was cracking, the European Middle Ages, but my heart was kind of, like telling me I needed to also explore my own history, our shared, inheritances, and I had to use the tools that I had of literary criticism and of certain kinds of research to try and put together, some questions and answers. And the reason that I was motivated to do so is there was an overall awareness that things were coming into the public domain. However, ironically, in my family, such connections were always there, because I had family. I had my aunts, who are sitting and watching us now from Dhaka. They were coming and going. We knew we had family in Pakistan. I mean, that we knew that we had a family home that was in now Bangladesh. At one point, East Pakistan. Before that, it was just Bengal. It was East Bengal, So this home in Faridpur was like a magnet, drawing stories to it. So there were all these fragments, and I knew they existed, but I had no tools. I had no means of putting them together to create a coherent history, a story, a narrative, which had everything placed for all of these parts of me. And so I really began on a journey of reorganizing myself academically. I'm an academic, so I can do academic research. So I thought, let me kind of try and do research into explaining something for myself and finding space in my life for those connections that I knew were there, but I had no language, no intellectual framework to actually even explain it in another way to myself. I was feeling it, but I needed to explain it. And I was very lucky, because thanks to my aunt Khushi Kabir, my aunt Naila Kabir, their friends and their colleagues and comrades, or people like, Urvashi Butalia, who's with us, Ritu Menon. And, these people but then I realized these are also the people who are writing the books now that are opening up the space. So lots of things came together for me and set me on this other direction, I would say, and which ended up in the book that I finally wrote, which is now 10 years ago. It's a story I wanted to tell that primarily of 1947 actually being intimately linked to 1971, because in my own life and family, that was what I knew. So I wanted to somehow be able to tell that. I wanted to be able to talk about intergenerational links that I know the others have also focused on, because we have moved away from partition. We are 3 generations away, but in the case of Bangladesh, it's 2 generations away. So there's also this kind of like, a kind of a stepped relation. It's not like, it's the gradations are different. And the generations, there were 3 generations involved with my family. I was the 3rd. So, there was an intergenerational compulsion to try and make sense of these stories. There were memories of places. There were fragments, again, material fragments, which again, Achal has written very well about. So lots of things were around me. And I really was motivated to, in a way, retrain myself, reuse my skills, which were being developed for one kind of humanities research into something that could make more sense for a lot of us, directly. So that's what I set out to do, and I'm glad that I had the chance and the means to do it.
Thank you, Ananya. That's I'd like to now invite Anam, if you could also, walk us through your journey.
Sure. Yeah. Firstly, thank you so much to the Southasia Peace Network for organizing this panel. Truly a pleasure and honor to be here today amongst all of you. And Priyanka, thank you for facilitating. So I'll just echo a lot of what you said, what has already been said by Ananya as well. I'm a 3rd generation Pakistani. I I was born in the late 80s, grew up in the 90s, so don't have that personal lived experience with 1947 or 71, but I also grew up in Punjab, and there is, at least on the Pakistani side of Punjab, a presence of partition. It is, like you said, said earlier, Priyanka, is very much tied to nation making. So we talk about it and we mark it every year. And because we don't talk enough about colonization, when we mark it, often in popular imagination, it's marked as independence from India or quote unquote Hindu India. So there's this larger kind of presence of partition over there that I grew up with, but it was also very much present in my own family's personal stories, my grandmother's stories, and so I would hear about it. But the way I came into this work or my research more formally is actually purely coincidental. I'm not an academic in that sense. This work is not an academic project. It happened through my first job with the Citizens Archive of Pakistan, which is a local nonprofit in Pakistan. And I was put in charge of the oral history program. And it was through these oral histories, as I was sitting down with partition survivors, that I began to realize how little I knew and how the narratives in mainstream society, in textbooks, even the oral histories in my own family were only part of the story, or were often distorted parts of the story, the larger narrative, censored part of that larger narrative. And so I wanted to know more. There were so many things that kind of struck me that did not fit with my understanding of what it meant to be a Pakistani, or my understanding of how I saw India growing up, or how I saw regional conflicts growing up. I won't go into a lot of detail, but for instance, as I was sitting there kind of hearing about members of different communities rescuing each other, right? Now, those are stories I had just not come across, and I wanted to know more. I wanted to know what these anomalies, what was happening over here, because I had grown up with narratives of bloodshed and animosity. I think particularly stories of people kind of longing to revisit their neighborhoods or their villages kind of really struck me, and also sat really oddly with my own perceptions, because in Pakistan, it's tied to nation making and it's tied to this triumph and this victory. So almost this understanding of never wanting to look back. And here were people who, by any definition, may define themselves as very patriotic Pakistanis, but were also saying, my dying wish is to be able to go and meet my friends, my neighbors, my family many times on the other side. So I began to realize that there was much more to learn for myself, and there was a lot to document, and that there was an urgency to document as well, because as I was doing this work, we were already losing many people who had lived through partition, and I was worried, and I continue to worry that with them we also lose the nuance, the varied experiences that don't make it to conventional histories, and because the other side of my work, on the other end of the spectrum, I do work with school children in the region as well. I can actually see the impact those myopic, distorted, censored histories have on younger generations, younger than myself. So there's this huge gap, and I do feel like oral histories and documenting this work can play a fundamental role in kind of bridging some of that. So that's how I got into this work. But once I got in, like you said earlier, I began to realize that partition was not something static. It's not just about looking back. It's also about how it shapes our present, and how partition itself has not only been unfolding and evolving in so many ways and manifesting in so many ways, but it's also been reimagined and repackaged differently by different nation states, right? So India has its own story, Bangladesh has its own story, Pakistan has its own story, and post-partition events, different wars that have been fought have reshaped the region and reshaped our understanding of partition, what borders meant in 1947, how families saw it, how people who decided to migrate, who had that option to migrate, who said, I can maybe have the best of both worlds, were very soon, especially after the 1965 war, hit with this reality that was not going to be possible. So I'm very curious about that kind of journey of partition after 1947 itself. And that work then took me to Kashmir, where the violence remains ongoing. And it was while I was in Kashmir that I realized that you really can't understand regional policies in Kashmir today if you don't look at 1971, and that eventually took me to Bangladesh. As you said, with 1971 as well, it's looked so differently amongst all three nations. It's referred to so differently, right? The terminologies that are used, it's termed as dismemberment in Pakistan, it's termed as liberation in Bangladesh. So what does that mean? What is a memory in Bangladesh? What is the silencing in Pakistan? Not only of what happened in 1971, but also how it continues to shape and reshape the region. I think it's one of the most defining events in the region's history, and I don't think it gets the kind of attention, especially in Pakistan, that it needs to. So that's really the evolution of my work and how I've been going about it.
Thank you, Anam. And you and Ananya have raised some very important points, which we'll come to before that. But I'd like to invite Anchal to just.
Thank you so much for having me, everyone. Thank you, Priyanka, for the kind introduction. And also, I'm very honored to be on the panel with Anam and Ananya. I think a lot of what I'll say is an echo of what my co-panelists have already said. But I grew up in India in the 90s. And I think for a lot of people like me, you could kind of ignore partition. You didn't really confront it on a day-to-day basis. And even when I learned about it in school, I did not go home and ask about it. That was not even a thought, because the manner in which it was taught was so distant. It was taught as an appendage to the freedom struggle. It was not taught as two very different events with two very different emotional and physical consequences. And so for most of my life, despite the fact that all four of my grandparents' families came from what became Pakistan, I don't think I ever asked the questions, and we didn't really have any discussions about it at home either. I was in grad school in my early 20s, and I also am not really an academic. I was training to be a printer, a metal engraver. And it was on a sabbatical year while I was in Montreal. I came back to Delhi on a sabbatical year, and I had actually no ideas for my thesis project. And it was then I encountered these very mundane objects that my mother's family had carried from Lahore to Amritsar and then to Delhi. And they were so ordinary. It was a vessel in which lassi is made, a ghada, and a guz that the family had used to measure fabric at their clothing store in Anarkali. And when my mother's father and uncle were holding on to these objects, they were touching them or talking about it, it was so transportive. I'd never seen any object transport someone, not just into the past, but also across this very impenetrable border with Pakistan. And it felt almost seamless. And I started becoming very interested in the power of material objects as catalysts for remembrance. And I think that was the first time I understood how important partition remained to my family, because of the way that they spoke about the event, because they spoke with this kind of longing of never having gone back or never being able to think about going back, also, that I really started to consider what partition had done to common people and why there was no vocabulary to discuss partition. I think for a very long time, partition was talked about in terms of politics and politicians, in terms of data and statistics, and not nearly enough in terms of the human consequences of it. Anna mentioned how, relationships were severed, friendships were sacrificed. None of these stories made it to the Indian side as well. I never heard them growing up. But moreover, I think it was one of those very odd situations when I began asking my family, I would get on questions asked back to me. So if I would ask my family, well, tell me about that time, they would say, well, why do you want to know and what will it change? And I think in these early discussions, when there was really no verbal language to speak about the past, or there was reticence or hesitation, that I turned to object memory. And I started asking people about the things that they had carried and why they carried those objects and how they, whether we can understand the notion of belonging to a place through the belongings that remained of that place. And through the objects, people started speaking about the ethnographic landscape of their early life, what their childhood was like, what their house looked like, why they chose to carry that object. And I think, objects are like democratic spaces, right? They have no religion, they have no nationality. help people travel without really physically traveling in a way. And it was quite beautiful to see that happen. And I eventually wrote a book about objects, migratory objects in partition. But the other really interesting thing that happened in these discussions was sometimes multiple generations of a family would sit down and talk about partition. And in these multi-generational conversations, sometimes things would come up that families had never heard before. Or sometimes younger generations would add to the story to say, oh, you told us about this, remember, mention this. Or sometimes they would challenge what their ancestor was saying based on what they had, heard in the news, or what they had learned about through the papers, or, keeping the legacy of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the 3-4 wars now at the back of their mind. And I became very interested in the passage of memory. Why is partition memory passed down, or is it at all, and how? Because as I mentioned earlier, sometimes verbal language cannot adequately describe the feeling of loss, longing, hurt, bitterness, anger, all of which comes up in conversations with partition survivors and their descendants. Moreover, I think it's interesting that when we speak about partition, sometimes testimonies can contradict their own telling, I suppose, because there is no one way to talk about partition, and there is no one way to receive its memory. There's no one homogeneous narrative of partition. It's only in its diversity that we truly understand the narrative, which is why oral history is so important, because it allows us to hear, stories of people in their own voice. So I think this is what I have done with partition so far, with survivors and with descendants, and of course, looking at the future, how younger people look at the very complicated relationship between the three nations and how we can move forward, which is also really the essence of this discussion today.
Yeah, thank you. So you've raised some very important points, like, the idea of the need to preserve memory, or the urgency to document, that brought you on this work. Like all three of you, it seems did not actually plan to work on this, but it's somehow that the work drew you. And the importance of also, like, for example, Ananya, when you mentioned that the narrative, the way the narratives you would encounter did not have space for you to be able to find your histories and your stories, and also the urgency of documentation, the importance of oral histories, which, so then I'm thinking about the idea of histories itself, which is like, when we talk about the shared history, but which history are we talking about? Because there are these histories which are constructed by the state for whichever, certain means. There are histories which are held by popular imaginations, which are also in part drawing from these narratives constructed by the state, but they could be also slightly different, shaped by, media and other happenings, that sort of the happenings since then, not necessarily, set in stone in time. And then there are these histories which are more so in terms of the experiences of lived realities, which are probably not discussed as much as they should be, or now are only being, discussed as much. And also then, when we're looking at histories, when they get constructed by the state, that, the histories of the victor and the defeated, in these histories, who becomes the hero, who becomes the villain, and all of that. And recently at Sapan, we had a we recently launched a film club, and we had a film screening of this film called Tang by, someone by Bani Singh, who was incidentally also not a filmmaker, but it was this urgency to tell the story that drew her to make this film, which has then been, it has been screened widely. And she, we had a discussion where she actually talked about how one of the reasons which got her to actually make this film was, and she actually termed the film as an ode to the histories that we do not read about, the histories that are missing from our history books. So how important, for that narrative to really get framed, and for us to be able to have a common language to discuss the, the spectrum of emotions and feelings again, because it's not one. It's like, for example, like Anshul, your book there is a chapter on each one, because there is no one way of experiencing it. So where and how can we come to actually develop that common language? Is it possible? And what would that look like, especially when these events, the way they get sort of, again, which we keep coming back to, the way these events themselves are looked upon as, for example, sometime back in last year in India, the day, it was termed as, this partition day of remembrance of horrors of partition, which again is taking away from so many more emotions and that are attached to it, even though there are other efforts also. I remember reading one about, which was about, I think, jointly celebrating this at Sapan. I'm just sharing the link as well. We actually made an appeal to commemorate 14th and 15th of August as days of reflection and compassion. Similarly, we also need to look at the way we can collectively view and imagine 1971 and the events thereafter. So what would be your thoughts on that? I'm just kind of intrigued to know how you think that narrative can be, that I wouldn't use the word narrative, but yeah, that collective imagination could look like and the form it could take. Again, Ananya, Anchal and Anam. So yeah, whoever would like to go.
Well,
Ananya, you're unmuted, so yeah.
Yeah, I just unmuted myself. The thing is, history, the word is actually extremely loaded, as we know. So even when we start saying other histories or, alternative histories or minor histories or, whatever alternative terminology we use kind of brings us back to the sense that there is a narrative out there which captures or tries to capture certain events. And the point about history is it's not just what happened, but how we explain that things happened, So there's a causality that the idea of history, which is in a sense folding into itself what we would technically call historiography, So the writing of history, the telling of history is actually extremely loaded. And my point is that I feel a bit frustrated sometimes that even in the sense of an alternative, we are kind of back to square one, that there is a narrative which must predicate a cause and an effect and a conclusion, a beginning, middle, and end. And these things are completely, like they're like ticking time bombs, because the minute you do that, you're automatically saying this happened because da-da-da. And then we fall into those frames of nationalist imaginaries, hijacking of certain narratives to suit certain purposes, as even Anam was mentioning in her contribution. And, then from there, it's yet another very obvious step towards instrumentalization of these ways of telling history for purposes which are quite suspicious, like this National Day of Remembrance, because the question is, who is asking us to remember what and for what purpose? And we are like a tinderbox, in South Asia. Any little, spark just lights things up, and then your borders, however hermetic they are not ever hermetic when it comes to violence spreading. So it's a huge responsibility to take, to say even that we want to construct another kind of a history, because we go. So my efforts in the last few years really have been trying to even think, can we move away from this very idea? Now, because we're trapped in words, sometimes we can't help but use the words when we want to say something else. So I'm more interested now in issues around feeling, around the senses, around, as that's why I like Anchal's work very much, the idea of tactility, things that you can touch, the senses, what you can smell, food, ways to continue traditions which have been brought across the borders in the body and in the family. And those traditions are often really powerful ways of making peace with the past. Though we never think about them that way. We never, because they're quotidian usually. This guz that you're talking about, it's not like a grand object. It's the way in which people were dealing their life with their everyday lives, earning money, the structure of commerce, which was brutally interrupted. People were successful probably when they reorganized themselves, and those successes, the guz is measuring that success too, because obviously your family came over and restarted life, and life carried on. I'm very interested in things like sensory modes of recollection and commemoration, bypassing words altogether, or in dialogue with words. Sometimes, like you said, the intergeneration family chat opens up certain things. So dialogue and chat and words are needed, but somehow trying to put the spotlight on other stuff as well, which are beyond words. So the sensorium of partition really is what I'm very interested in these days. Therefore, can we engage communities like school kids, to go back to Anam's work, into thinking about recipes, what kids share because their families have brought them down the generations. Can that be a way to open up moments of like epiphany that, we actually also share a lot of stuff, that kind of a thing. So really a sensory non-history of partition maybe is and beyond is the way I would want to go beyond it. So those are the things I'm thinking about these days, and connected with that is the idea of also a before, people who left before 1947. So I'm really interested in thinking about groups that moved much earlier out of South Asia, when it wasn't even called South Asia, when there was no Pakistan, in British India, when people were going as indentured laborers, carrying certain memories and histories with them in their bodies. I mean, can we do some linkages? So these are my new preoccupations. But really, they're not academic preoccupations. They're just not intellectual preoccupations. They're preoccupations because I'm impatient with the limitations and dangers of the idea of history itself.
Thank you. And I think I loved the idea of sensorium of partition. And also when you sort of talked about the problem with history or narrative, I was thinking about this thing that you mentioned in your book about how narrative sort of privileges closure and this idea of meaning making that we run after, and then how that itself can get kind of problematic. So I'd like to invite Anam and Anchal, would you like to go first?
Sure. So much of what you said, Ananya, resonates with me. I also want to say there's a beautiful book called In Sensorium by a perfumer artist called Tanais, who's Bangladeshi, and they write a lot about this. So if anyone is looking for a book recommendation,
put that in the chat for us, please.
Yes, I will. So many things I'm thinking about as well, but I think this right now, this conversation is us imagining a different kind of history writing. I don't know if these kind of conversations will ever happen on a national level, let alone a multinational level with all three countries. So perhaps platforms like this is where it happens and where it begins from, at least. When I was writing my last book, it was when the announcement of Partition Horrors Remembrance Day was done in 2021. And it was really at the back of my mind because so many of the questions that have been raised already about it were questions that resonated with me, like why do we only need to remember horrors, and why even be a national day of memorialization? What do we do with memorialization of traumatic events where in a country like India, where everything south of Maharashtra experienced independence and the North experienced partition, but also it really made me realize how Indo-centric conversations really are about partition. And this is something Anam and I have discussed multiple times, and how, in my opinion, through my work, the one thing I have tried to do is unlearn, because, this is also a way of upbringing that I inherited. So a lot of conversations lead me to unlearn things that I don't even know I have inherited as a part of my upbringing. But when I was writing my last book, which is on generational memory, so multi-generational perspectives on partition, the one thing that I really struggled with was how to categorize the interviews from the three different nations, because I had interviews from Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and the diaspora. And it's strange, despite being so non-divisive in your thinking, your first mode of categorization is always divisive. So I'm thinking, yes, of course, I'll put them as India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And I sat with that concept for a while, and it really made me feel very stupid, because if you are you're striving to break those divisions in your work, and this kind of goes against that. So then I thought, well, I can't categorize them on the basis of religion, because some don't really fit and some have too much. And eventually I went with exactly what Ananya said, I went with emotion. So I have 24 chapters in the book based on emotion. It ranges from belonging and beginnings to fear and reunion and separation and the quotidian and love and friendship and hope, things that you never think about when it comes to the landscape of partition. But the one problem I have with the way we remember partition, and again, so many people have already said this, and many will in the future, that we do it through the lens of violence primarily, and we have become very accustomed and very comfortable with that, because the first images we think about are those trains and people walking and blood and bodies in water. But we never really think about friends being separated or lovers being separated or lovers finding one another in camps. And these are very much also the stories of partition that come up when you sit and speak to people, because the survivor's memory is not vague. It is incredibly nuanced. It is incredibly sensorial. It is incredibly detailed. They remember the smell of when they left their house. They remember the roti burning. They remember the clothes they were wearing. They remember the friend they didn't say bye to. And this is what makes the event human, not in its numbers or statistics, but in the stories behind those numbers. And I don't know, I think the work that we are doing is small, but over time it gains resonance. Oral history has a lot of shortcomings and people are really quick to point them out. But I think archival history or conventional sources of narration have proved inadequate to really show the depth of trauma that still exists and is passed down without us even understanding how. Because even in silence, trauma is passed down. Actually, often in silence, trauma is passed down. And I think, I don't know, I don't really have an end to what I'm saying right now, but I really believe in the work we are all doing here, not just us speakers, but also people that bring us together, because this is the way we can imagine another kind of history, right? I always have a problem with when we say the other side, even Ananya talked about that terminology. I have a huge problem with that, because it makes us think of people across the border as other. It is in the very terminology. So, here's slowly breaking that one barrier at a time, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't think this is small work, by the way, the oral histories and all of this work, because like you've already mentioned, how inadequate conventionally things have been. This is important to bring that out, because especially when we know that it continues to shape us. Anna, would really appreciate your thoughts, and also if you could, sort of bring to fore how sort of, the importance of taking these histories to people, like you talked about children, working with children, for example. So something like that, if you could also perhaps highlight.
Sure. It's I don't know what to say, because I think what Ananya and Anshul said so beautifully and powerfully captured everything I feel. It resonates so much with me. Like Ananya, I've also increasingly become uncomfortable with asking the why and the what, and finding that causal relationship, because eventually, in some way or the other, it ends up explaining, justifying, and then often being instrumentalized, as Ananya, you said. And I think this is the case even with oral history work, right? When we go down and we sit with people and we say, why did this happen, right? There will be different interpretations of it, which are very valuable. But then I start to wonder, what do we do with this? And I think that this work is tricky, Priyanka. I mean, I think your question is wonderful. I wish I had a simple answer to it, but this work is really, really tricky, because as you pointed out, language is so political and it is so loaded. And there are certain terminologies, if they're used in certain countries, I mean, that is in itself a charge of being unpatriotic or, unnationalistic and all of that, right? For instance, and I've quoted this before, written about this, once I was invited for a talk on partition. And then I was told in Pakistan, and then I was told, don't talk about partition, talk about independence. And I really don't know how to do one without the other. But there's a certain foreclosing, there's a certain bracketing, right, when it comes to language and what is permissible and what is not. So I completely echo what, the work that Anshul is doing and everything that Ananya said in terms of trying to see what we can do to move beyond. In my own work, I've become very, very curious about how to bring in silences. And I don't have an answer to this, but I think it's really important to question it, because a lot of times when you're sitting down with people and when you're documenting trauma memories, they don't come in a coherent flow. We know that, right? They come in utterances and fragments and silences and pauses and things that cannot be said. So I'm also very reluctant to push people. I do believe that sharing can have very, very healing impacts, but I also feel that as oral historians, as researchers, we have to be very, very careful about where we go and realizing this is not just a story for people. So the ethics of that come in, and I want to be able to translate some of those silences, some of the things that remain non-verbal, that are just visceral, onto the page. It is not my job necessarily to recover. I don't see it that way. Personally, I'm very interested in how those macro popular histories shape the personal. I don't think they can ever be teased apart or ever insulated from one another. I know that we have the best of intentions when we say that all hostility is at the state level and at the people level. There's so much love, and of course there is. But I also don't think the two operate so distinctly from each other. I do think that there's an overlap, there's an influence, and so what's happening in the larger society will inevitably have an impact, and that's where my concerns lie, because I've done intergenerational work and I've seen that hostility only increase over the years. So when I now go and do these interviews, I'm very interested in what you are remembering, right? Why are you remembering that, and to whom are you remembering that? What does it mean to say this to a Pakistani? What is my position in the room? If it was not me, what else would come up? What else would get evoked, right? So I'm not just interested in the story, but in how that story emerges or does not emerge many times as well. So that's how I'm kind of approaching my work. In terms of bringing this to children, I think the lesson for me through all of this work has been that we need to get comfortable with our uncomfortable past, and we need to get comfortable with contradictions. I think states have a very effective way of purifying and sanitizing and selecting certain histories and packaging them and then providing them in digestible ways. And that history is very exclusionary. It is very different depending on what side of the border you're at. And I think oral histories can disrupt that. Now, it's not about other history, alternative history, or this truth or that truth. I think it's about bringing together multiple voices and those contradictions, because whenever I've done partition, interviews or even interviews in 1971, within the same story, people will be talking about being attacked by members of one community and also often being rescued. And those contradictions are the only truth. And so those are the stories I want to bring forth. It's not like I want to produce another sanitized, purified version and say, well, no, this is the history you should listen to, but to get children to really engage and to say, well, if this is how we imagine it in Pakistan, right, this is what your textbooks are saying. What are your family members saying? What are other people saying? And then what are people in Bangladesh saying, maybe? Okay. And if they're saying this, let's just pause and let's just sit down for a moment. And let's engage with that. Let's question. Let's be curious, right? How are children in India learning? Can we talk? Can the children sometimes, where it's possible, especially through the use of technology, can you talk to each other? And I kid you not, that dialogue is really, really transformative. I've seen that happen within 20 minutes, 40 minutes, because to go back to what Anshul was saying, it helps us. I believe all work is political, so I'm not saying we're moving beyond politics, but what it helps us do is it brings a human dimension and it humanizes the other person, right? And that does not have to mean that all questions have to be resolved. That's what I mean by it's okay to be uncomfortable. It is okay to sit with those contradictions, but it's still really important to open that dialogue. And I think I'm just reinforcing that, because I think sometimes we think that these conversations always have to be, that they will always be about peace, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes questions will be raised, sometimes discomfort will be raised, and I think that is okay. We need to be okay with that. We need to be able to facilitate that. We need to be able to sit with that, and that will help us move forward.
Yeah, thank you, Anam. And you actually raised an important point also when you talked about the ways in which this is shaping and the how the question of identities comes in here as well, which is also so inextricably linked when which identities are sort of foregrounded and which are pushed to the background. So, for example, if we again are examining or looking at 1947 and 1971, in 1947, religion is what sort of emerges, in the front. But then we so then, as history bears witness, in 1971 we have so we have more markers of identity more than religion, which is what history bears witness to, and this sort of the ways in which this is all interlinked and the way it continues to shape and reshape the landscapes of identities, if I may so call it, even in present day context. And so, for example, again, when we are, and we have a shared heritage in all of this as well. So, it was very interesting, for example, when I read about Ustad Daman, that, you'd mentioned to, or if you talk about, say, for example, Firdausi Begum is singing fairs. And so, there's this shared heritage that is running through, but there are also these questions of identity which are brought up in a way that forces people, not all perhaps, but sections of people to, instead of sort of accepting or celebrating the diversities, try to play up those differences, which would then, again, discrimination and then also violent conflict for that matter. So, for example, we're talking about, so when I'm sitting in India here, for example, next year will also mark 75 years since the assassination of Gandhi, which, so again, 1947, so we have, their lines are drawn, so to say, in terms of religion, but then the first major act of terrorism, if I may so call it, was actually, Gandhi murdered by, again, somebody from Nathuram Godse, who was, and, the right-wing Hindu organizations involved in all of, and these questions of identity are coming to the fore again. So when we, as we speak, the regimes that are in power and the questions that are coming up, the violence that, for example, in Pakistan, so in India, for example, the violence that Muslims are subjected to, not just in terms of these major events, but also the everyday violence and the assault on lives and livelihoods, which comes to fore, when particular regimes come into power. But there are those other sort of ways in which that goes on. In Pakistan, for example, when we say Ahmadis are subjected to violence, but then also, the first foreign minister of Pakistan was Ahmadi, right? If I'm not wrong, I think, right? So, where and how can these collective imaginations also perhaps find a way to navigate these questions of identity and, the sort of the kind of questions that it brings up about belonging, who gets included, who gets excluded, and who is actually, making those sort of trying to bring up those questions or trying to respond to those questions. Is that, I don't know if I'm... Yeah, Ananya, Anshul, Anna would...
I actually found some of the comments on in the chat quite interesting, picking up on all the things we've been saying. And in a way to respond to the question you've thrown out, I think I'm just going to pick up some of the things people have been saying. For example, somebody has mentioned a project where people are planting trees, on the border.
I think that's the proposal also.
Yeah, someone else is saying, is asking, how do we deal with trauma while you're doing research on traumatic events? People are saying, how can we think about positive acts of people helping each other and being good neighbors, good friends, and, human. And it's kind of interesting because I find all these questions converging, all these comments converging onto an issue which I find really crucial these days. I am quite also, not only am I impatient with this idea of history with a capital H, which then dominates our imagination as the only way out to address the past. I'm also quite impatient with something that has been unavoidable so far, but I think we can also move away from it going forward, which is an emphasis on all the horrors. Like there's been a lot of horror, there's been a lot of trauma, but the point is that if we keep remembering only that dimension of human, then I think we
गोभी को इसमें डालने को कौन बोला?
maybe we can ask.
Sorry, carry on. Yeah.
So, the point is, we also, as I said before, I think we all we know of instances, and we ourselves have drawn on resources which are in a way positive, to survive and to move on. And I think that we really must try to highlight those instances, which are ongoing. I don't think they ever weren't there, because every act of survival after partition had to involve bringing together enormous resources, positive energies of the body. And I really like the film Bhag Milkha Bhag for this reason, because it literally shows us how Milkha Singh used his trauma of running away as a boy from the violence of his village in what then became Pakistan, and he kind of converted that energy into something positive. Now, the problem for me with the film is that it retains it on a nationalistic level, because he then becomes India. There's this byline in the film, Milkha Ban Gaya India. So, his positive transformation has become re-embedded into the nation state frame. There must be other ways in saying we transformed ourselves through our inner resources, but we didn't just do it because we wanted to become good Indians. We wanted to become good human beings. We wanted to be good neighbors. We wanted to just, reconcile ourselves with the past. There are many different ways in which you could say this positive energy was deployed. But the film is good because it shows that this is indeed also happening. It's, for me, one of the few films that really foregrounds the body as a channel of transformation of its own traumas. So for me, this is super, super important as a way forward. And I was just looking up this beautiful book that you pointed us to, Aanchal, while you were talking. This is amazing. This book by called Insensorium by a Bangladeshi origin perfumer who has created a company called Tanais. I must say, my God, this is why we go on talks like this, because we learn something like this. It's so amazing. And she says in an interview with they say in an interview with Harper's Bazaar that it is so important, they say, to touch joy. So I'm going to delve into this book as soon as I can find it, which is essentially, it seems to me, South Asian diasporic persons reckoning with the resources of their past through a history of perfume making, which is their means to also touch joy and fight patriarchy at the same time. Fighting patriarchy through making perfume seems to me to be kind of a good way forward, So this is for me a kind of let's see where we can go next. We've obviously done a lot of reckoning. That was very important for these 20 years between, I think, the 50th and the 70th milestones. What next? Touch joy is my mantra.
Thank you. And I think you also bring up a very important point about this sort of moving beyond that. So I actually shared a link to what has been happening at Sapan. Like, this is the 14th in this series called Imagine Neighbours in Peace. And Beena's here because she keeps always harping on the idea of a counter narrative. So what's been happening is, in addition to a lot more that's going on, there are these events which happen monthly, part of the series called Imagine Neighbours in Peace, often on different themes, which brings together activists and experts working on different subject areas, and always somehow sort of brings home the point how there is so much that kind of brings us together. And there's actually reason for us to work together and collectively as South Asians. And yeah, I'd like to invite Anam to share her thoughts.
Sure. I think Anshul, you were going to say something. Go ahead first. I can come in later.
And we'll also then come to
Go ahead.
taking up comments and questions from the
Sure.
audience. So people who please feel free to just share in chat your questions, comments.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add is that, this question about identities is very interesting. And again, it's not like 47 happened or 1971 happened. And in that one moment, everybody just picked an identity or, it just completely transformed. That's not how people are. In fact, I've looked at this in my work. I was very curious, at a personal level, how do you go from maybe, identifying as an Indian to a Pakistani to a Bangladeshi? What are those personal moments, personal factors that happen? And they don't necessarily have to be at the time in which nations mark it, right? And in many ways, I think that what gives me hope, Priyanka, is...
Please, and could people please keep themselves on mute? Yeah, sorry.
What gives me a lot of hope is that despite state efforts to homogenize, right, identities don't get homogenized that way. So when I'm sitting down with people, like somebody who's Bangladeshi but not Bengali, what does that mean? If you're Bengali but you're Pakistani, what does that mean? Of course, it can have really grave repercussions. If you're Hindu Pakistani, what does that mean? Right? And those identities and those challenges to those identities have also, of course, shifted over time. Like an interview I was doing very recently of a family in Thar in Sindh, Pakistan, said, we didn't really feel the impact as the Hindu community of 1947 till 1971. That's when we actually felt partition. So it evolves, it changes, but even till today, you will find syncretic practices, you will find those what may seem contradictory, those identities very much sitting comfortably in some cases with people. And I think that in itself is resistance. And you see this even politically. So when I was doing the work on 1971, it was so important to go to Bangladesh to document that memory. But as a Pakistani, it was also very, very important to actually do that work in Pakistan. I come from Punjab, and my father served in the army, and it was so important for me to kind of unpeel the narratives I was accustomed to, the dominant narratives in society. And suddenly here I am sitting in Punjab, coming across people like the late Ayar Rahman or the poet Ahmed Salim, who actually, during 1971 were part of the protests, were part of the resistance against the state. So I think that despite states' efforts to categorize, to package people into distinct identities, it doesn't necessarily manifest that way. And I think there's power in that, there's hope in that. And it's those kind of stories when they come forth that I think have the potential to move the dialogue beyond as well.
Yeah, thank you, Anam, for your comments. And Anshul, also, actually, there's a question on chat, so I just bring it up because it's related, the question of identities, where Shahzad Iqbal has asked to you, the questions for you about how you grapple with identity with regards to the people you've interviewed, whether they're survivors of partition or younger generations. So yeah, if we could get your thoughts, and then we'll sort of have a round of perhaps closing thoughts before we then take up questions and thoughts from the audience. So we invite people to engage.
So I think partition continues to shape and inform the identities of multiple generations of South Asians today. And sometimes with the younger generation, people like my generation, we don't even realize that it is happening until we really sit down and think about it. And these identities are quite complicated, and in some cases, they are still fully being realized and reckoned with. The one thing, because I worked with survivors and descendants, the one thing that I find very interesting with survivors is that, and this goes back to what Anam is saying, that people when people accept identity, adopt identity, choose to discard identity, or have dual identities sometimes is very interesting. With the generation of survivors, very often I find people saying, I'm Indian, but I'm also Peshawari. I am Pakistani, but I feel Lucknowi. In one case, I recorded a story where this man from Jalandhar, he migrated from Jalandhar to Pakistan during partition, and he just couldn't believe that Jalandhar, which was 51% Muslim at that time, would not be a part of Pakistan. So he added the word Jalandhari to his name to carry that identity with him everywhere. I remember interviews with Hindu and Sikh Sindhis that focused very much on the aspect of assimilation into their new geographies, wherever they went, the gaining of a new, not just nationality, but, kind of hybrid ethnicities that they had to gain, whether they came to Kalyan or they came to Maharashtra, or they went to anywhere in the world, of not passing down mother tongue, of being stateless, but also being people of the world in some way because they had left their land entirely behind. There is this one incident from my research of the last few years that I want to share, because it should show that even people who work in this field are not, we're not perfect, and we need to constantly work on ourselves. I was doing an interview with a young Hindu man who had grown up in Pakistan. And he was telling me about his family and why they chose to stay in this small village called Mitti, which is closer to Rajasthan than it is to any big city really in Pakistan, in Sindh. But, throughout the interview, he kept saying Pakistani Hindu, and I kept saying Hindu Pakistani. And it happened a few times because he was talking about how his primary identifier was as a Pakistani, regardless of his religion. And I think it took me a very long time to really think about the fact that I was saying Hindu Pakistani, because those are two different ways to identify. And I kept thinking to myself, well, I don't say Muslim Indian or Christian Indian or Hindu Indian or Parsi Indian, Jain Indian. So why am I saying Hindu Pakistani? He is saying Pakistani Hindu. And, it really helped me shift and again unlearn, because we are constantly unlearning. So that's one. But I think another thing I encountered were people who were kind of felt like their identities were stuck in no man's land. In a way, I was interviewing a father and son together once. They lived in Karachi, and they said how their multiple migrations from Calcutta to Dhaka and then from Dhaka to Karachi after 71 made it very difficult for them to apply for any form of identification in Pakistan, because questions were always raised about their journeys and their dates and their paperwork. Everything would be scrutinized. So to claim any singular identity remained very difficult for them. And then at the end of the interview, the father, he said to me, because I was interviewing them for my book, he said, you must write this in your book. कि ये जरूर लिखना कि हम ना इस घाट के हैं ना इस घाट के. We are neither from this side, we are neither from this side. कि अभी तक हम कश्ती में घूम रहे हैं. We are from nowhere. We belong to neither side, and we are still adrift in that boat, place to place, adopting the nationality of any place our boat docks. जहाँ पे गए वहीं की पनाह ले ली. And it really hit me. And then his son said that there was no sense of true belonging. So there are people like this also, 75 years later, during the anti-CA NRC protests, this question of identity and paperwork came up in a lot of families, not only of minority religion, but Bengali families, also Hindu Bengali families, reopening the wounds of partition. And I think this was, in some cases, it kind of did what 84 did, that it brought the question of partition up again, because events of trauma in the present, partition sometimes sets a precedent for the very fragile state of identity you have in a particular place. And I remember many of the descendants that I spoke to said that during the CA NRC protest was the time that stories of partition really came up. And someone said to me that no matter how long it has been for their family in India, no matter how stable their life was, no matter how cemented their citizenship may be, the very discussion aroused fear and reminded them of what they had been through once. So, and I mean, it really struck me that this was just after the 70th anniversary, but it struck me that partition even then felt so recent to people. It felt too immediate, too traumatic. And of course, there is a very, very common question of ancestral land and where are you from? Something that a lot of surprisingly descendant interviews echoed for me, that a lot of people kept saying, where is my native land? Or when we were young, when everyone went on summer vacations, I had no place to go because, and this is the case for me also. I have no ancestral land. I have no pin. My grandparents, both sets, lived in refugee colonies in Delhi. And if I have to go in the place of my origin, it lies on the other side of that border. And I think this is something that a lot of young people now, especially with the advent of social media and seeing the villages and cities that their families have come from, have a desire to go and to witness and to walk with dignity on, So I think identity is very much a very pertinent topic. And of course, diaspora identities are multi-hyphenated identities, even more so. But I think it remains very topical for us.
Thank you, Aanchal. So we have many questions and comments on the chat, and unfortunately for paucity of time, we're not able to invite everybody to speak and share. But I'd like to just read out some questions. And I know Vishal has asked a question. Sorry. Yeah, so he's asked, mainland ideas have shaped most of our history textbooks, and he wants to know your perspectives on fault line regions, which are not in a way part of using so just quoting this side or the other side, like the Pahari speaking areas of Mirpur, Poonch and Rajouri presently parts of India and Pakistan, parts of Greater Shailat now divided between India and Bangladesh, the Marha cultural belt of Punjab, areas which are not only the most affected, and even by partition, even till this day, people of these areas face the heat because of being near the borders. So don't you feel partition shall be viewed in more micro terms when it comes to our textbooks? And do you feel that the day is possible given the current climate in our nations?
Shall I just answer?
So whoever would like to respond, if you could just...
I can respond very quickly to
Sure.
the textbook thing in regards to India, at least. Sadly, after COVID, the NCERT curriculum has removed the subject of partition from the textbooks, at least for now, which has not stopped teachers from teaching it, because that will never happen. But formally in textbooks, certain grades are not taught partition because of the trauma that, I guess the reason cited is post-COVID. It's very traumatic. But there are other sections of history that have also been removed from textbooks for now. But also the things that you're talking about, like the Pahari speaking region of Mirpur, Poonch, yes, absolutely. Anam has done a lot of work in the Neelam Valley of Kashmir, so she can probably speak to that as well. Actually, Anam, I remember this lovely story from your research where people, when it was safer, people would see each other on either side of the river. Maybe you could tell us about that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, on the line of control in Neelam, a lot of times the quote unquote border is actually water, right? And in the winter months, it would shrink. And prior to social media becoming relatively more accessible, though still, of course, so disrupted in Kashmir, families would sit by on both sides of the river, and that was one way to meet. And so it's actually quite fascinating how even outside of Kashmir borders, I usually think of the Wagah border when I think of the border, but in many parts borders are not like that. And it is at the border where you can catch a glimpse of one another, where farmers are kind of working, and there's a small, row of plants or barbed wire that are separating. You can't travel across, and there are grave repercussions if you do, of course. But that the borders, it's just the reality of it is so different than how we imagine it. And some families have only been able to meet at different borders. So I think those are very, very interesting stories as well. Yeah.
I think also now places like Kartarpur are so important to any kind of, friendships and families meeting, any kind of reunions.
Yeah, I think this notion of the borderlands, which is what the question from Vishal, I think it was, right, who was sort of gesturing towards, that there are zones of transition. They're sort of geocultural zones, and they have been traditionally also often very nomadic populations would traverse them. These are issues that go back to colonization, and how even the colonizers wanted to stamp out such behavior as somehow deviant, because the whole idea was to create a population that was just kind of rooted in one place. And that's also like, you have a certain kind of property regime going on, and so I find it very interesting that indeed constantly flouting, if you like, these logics, which are quite superimposed, the logic of property, the logic of capitalism, the logic of patriarchy, the logic of nation states, therefore partition, kind of hardening those borders and so on. But kind of constantly these gray zones, literally, I think, keep us on our toes and constantly give us counterexamples that actually people are crossing, recrossing, sharing another kind of epistemology. And geography enables that sometimes. Sometimes geography kind of, actually becomes like if they're impassable mountains, but mountains themselves are not like one line. There's space on either side of and those spaces I find very fascinating. And the area between the LOC, the line of control, and the de jure and the de facto borders in Kashmir, I think, is a very good example of an entire borderland space. And things are going on in that borderland, and people are living, and people are connecting. And I think since I'm a literature student, I look at literature, I look at, imaginative responses to these issues more than, say, oral history or people's kind of, immediate responses to these moments. There are stories like Manto's stories, and there's this the Dog of Titwal, is a very good story, very important story about that borderland. So we have different ways of people thinking about the fuzziness of borders as well as the hardness of border lines. So borderlands, and Gloria Anzaldúa, very famous feminist Chicana writer, wrote about borderlands as the space of the woman's body itself, between Mexico and the USA. That was the borderland she was talking about. So many people have talked about borderlands, and I think borderlands are always an interesting way to think counter borders, and works of art, works of the imagination take us there, and make us think a little bit harder about what does it mean to live in the borderland? What lessons do we take back from those lives for our everydays to kind of, denaturalize the border? So again, making school children think about these stories, about these moments of encounter, how would they be encouraged to rethink what they always thought was like normal, but denormalizing it in different ways. So, yeah.
You're muted, Priyanka.
Yeah, so we kind of running over time, and there are two comments that I'd like to pick up from the chat which have been shared. So, and then, I just invite you if you'd like to share some closing thoughts before we move to, further, where we also have Hamida Hussain and Varsh Butalia to share their closing remarks. So, Momel Mehraj wrote that she's starting to research Kashmir, which is political issues almost as old as partition, and has found that the need to forget is more pronounced than the need to remember and archive history. And this becomes complicated because the history is still ongoing and the trauma hasn't been over and digested yet. So we've only just started to talk about partition, but that temporal distancing hasn't happened yet in Kashmir, and she faces ethical dilemmas as to how to even, go to people and repeal their memories, which are often traumatic. And another comment from Khushi, which was in context to something that Anshul, you were talking earlier, which resonates with what's happening in Bangladesh, where there's a discourse of whether one is a Bengali Muslim or a Muslim Bengali, and about how these are not nationalities but identity, or whether one's cultural identity is more important than the religious identity. And given the current political religious identity as determining feature as a nation, this discussion is important. So yeah, so there was, and I'm sorry we're not able to invite people because of paucity of time, but there are also people who shared their personal thoughts and stories. So Rafiq Katwari, who presented the charters, also shared, people can see on the chat about his book of poetry, which connects with the idea of sensorium that we were talking about. Anil Ghai had written and wanted to share. So he's been to Pakistan, and he has family which moved from, across. So he wanted to share, but again, due to paucity of time, we're not able to invite. So I'd now like to actually open up to Ananya, Anam, and Anshul, if you want to share, any final thoughts before we sort of move ahead for the event. But maybe, in terms of, so we've discussed something about that, but yeah, ways and modes of jointly addressing these stories or memories. I'm not using the word histories, because we've been, again, talking about how loaded that can get, but yeah, ways of jointly addressing these stories and memories. Yeah, so we are, so Ananya, Anshul, and Anam. And then we'll move ahead because we also have with us Hamida Hussain and Urvashi Battalia, who will be presenting closing remarks.
I actually think we've done a really, it's a nice start to talk about different yet similar approaches to issues that don't seem to go away. And I hope that we can continue to have these conversations. And in an interesting way, the COVID pandemic, which was also traumatic, as we know, in its own way, opened up unexpectedly resources to come together. We would never have so many intense online conversations across time zones and spaces before. And we suddenly discovered that. So maybe this kind of, turning a bad thing into something positive can also, in its own way, fuel the transformations we would like to see in South Asia, in terms of connecting and conversing and sharing. So more to all of this.
Yeah, I'll echo what Ananya said. I think technology and these kind of conversations have a lot of power, and I'm so glad we were able to do this. And, it's just one of many conversations, hopefully. I would just very quickly like to respond to something that Mamal raised. I think that the work in Kashmir, or when you're working with ongoing violence, is very different. It requires a different ethics and sensibility. Of course, I think that fundamentally, Mamal, it comes back to us as researchers, as oral historians, not kind of defining what people should remember or what people should forget. I think that's really important. Yes, we've talked about, looking at partition through the lens of violence. At the same time, there's so many stories that have yet not been documented. And if that is something that people want to share, whether in the context of partition or in terms of ongoing violence, then that space needs to be created ethically, sensitively. It's just about not defining that people must remember or must remember a certain kind of story. It's about letting people kind of, I think, direct what they choose to share with whom they choose to share. So I hope that helps a little bit, and I'll pass it to Anshul, and then really looking forward to the closing remarks. Thank you all again so much.
Thank you for having me, and just so much to think about when being on a panel like this. But I think the one thing that I'm always left with, either when I write on partition or when I'm on any kind of discussion about it, is that I don't actually know when there will be any official reconciliation or truth commission or whatever is required for us to be civil on a national official level. But if that doesn't happen, then it depends on people like us, ambassadors of shared culture, people like artists, filmmakers, oral historians, writers, musicians, all kinds of artists that rely on things that go beyond national identity in their work. And I think they aid in stretching our imaginations beyond the border in some way. And of course, organizations like Sapan and discussions like this that encourage people to unlearn. I think that's one of the greatest things that I have learned in my short career as an oral historian, that every day when I speak to someone, I will be learning something new and unlearning something that I didn't even know, like a preconceived notion I didn't even know I possessed. So yeah, I'm really grateful to be here and look forward to more discussions like this in the future.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ananya, Anam, and Anshul, for this conversation. And also, when we were talking about this, we've again shared links to Sapan's appeal, which was about commemorating 14th and 15th as days of reflection, compassion, just again, part of, a way of looking at things differently, and also linked to Sapan's events. If you'd like to go through, Bina also shared link to the founding charter, so which again becomes part of the counter narrative, like sort of the collective reimagination, so to say, that we can work towards. And now I'd like to hand it over back to Bina.
Thank you, Priyanka, so much. Thank you, Anchal, Anam, Ananya. It's been wonderful listening to all three of you, and very nicely done, nicely moderated, Priyanka. Thank you for your insightful comments and questions as well. I'm really thrilled and honored and excited to have two really giants among us to share closing remarks here. And that is Urvashi Butalia and Hamida Hussain. Urvashi Butalia, I don't think either of them really need an introduction, but we did prepare these bio slides. So just for anyone who doesn't know them, Urvashi's seminal work, of course, published first in 1998. So that is like 25 years ago or something like that. My math is not good, but it's a long time ago. That's a seminal work on the silenced, the other side of silence, voices from the partition. And so we'll ask Urvashi to briefly share closing remarks, and then Hamida Appa in Hamida Hussain in Dhaka. And Hamida Hussain, of course, is also somebody who is, she's Sindhi by birth and Bengali, so that again is part of this fluidity of identities. She was Sindhi, Pakistani, then Sindhi, Bengali, and now, and she's as a prominent human rights activist and writer as well. So I'd like to invite them both to unmute themselves and join us. And thank you, everyone. And Urvashi, if you would like to go first.
Thank you, Bina. Hamida, do you want to go first? But Hamida might like to.
I don't see Hamida Appa. We need to see your video so we can spotlight you.
Hunting for.
Where is Hamida Appa?
I can't see her.
Hamida Appa, are you there? She might, it's actually very late in Dhaka where she is.
Yeah, that's why I was thinking there might be better. But anyway, I'll go first, so to save time. So thank you, Sapan, and thank you, all three of you, all the, within quotes, all the girls, all the young women, all starting with A and all of that stuff. It's a brilliant discussion, and I want to start by telling you about three things. One is that a couple of weeks ago, I listened to a lecture on partition on another panel, and they had a series of 3 lectures. They were all by men, and they were deadly boring because there was really nothing beyond Jinnah and Nehru and the politics of the Muslim League and the politics of the Congress. And the richness of the discussion that you had today, so ably moderated by Priyanka, was completely missing. And the second thing that I want to mention to you is that just 2 days ago, I was talking to someone approximately your age in Delhi, a woman from Kashmir who is tracing a similar history in Kashmir of her family. And it's a personal history which has drawn her in much in the same way as the three of you are talking about it. And I thought that that has a lot of resonance with what you're saying. And when you spoke of the importance of reaching out to young people, particularly school children, I was reminded of a very interesting initiative. And I think one of the creators of that initiative is in this meeting. And that is by a group called Ririti, that's based in Bangalore. And what it is a kind of immersive video experience in which is addressing young children in which you enter the story of partition through the stories of families, and then the children are offered choices of which decisions to make, and each decision has a set of consequences that leads you to a completely different trajectory in your history. So understanding, and Bhanu is here, yes, she is from DDT, and I think she's put the link over there. So just to mention those things to you. And I basically, from your discussion, it's so rich, it's very difficult to give any closing remarks, but thank you for pointing to the things that don't often get talked about and that are difficult to talk about, which is emotions, feelings, the personal entanglement in the histories that you are pursuing, the ways in which the microhistories connect with and are shaped by the macrohistories, so that those distances between them actually do not necessarily exist. Thank you for pointing to the need to move away from the trope of violence, which has too narrowly defined our understandings of partition, and pointing to other possibilities of exploring the depth and layeredness of these histories, including the positive stories that will come out of it, not only the stories of the ways in which communities supported each other, but also the stories of how people made their lives. And in this sense, I'm thinking of a lot of women who experienced the tragedy in multiple ways and then found a place for themselves in a society which was transformed by this major political, historical event, and which continues, as you said, to this day. So thank you for pointing also to its long legacies. One of the issues that you pointed to was language, and I think that that's really important, the difficulty of finding a vocabulary in which to articulate the experience of partition. And I think if you look at that in depth, and if you explore it in depth, you will also see the gendered nature of language, where there is a way in which inhabiting of the public world that men have access to gives them a language to at least partially describe what they've gone through. And there is a way in which the silences that women maintain, and again, you all pointed to the question of silence and how we need to explore those silences very much. Anam, thank you very much for pointing to the ethics, and also all of you for addressing this question of the importance and the danger of remembering, the ways in which memory is healing and brings us together, but the ways in which memory can also be divisive because it is so shaped by current realities and transforms into the divisiveness of current realities. And therefore, the responsibility on memory seekers sits very heavy and has to bring in the ethics of talking to people so that they are not mere instruments, but they are actually very valued and important actors in that history, in that story, and in our pasts, which you are trying to trace in different ways. I also wanted to address the fact that a very important point made by all of you was how the kind of searches that you're making into the histories of partition need to embrace multiple histories inside them. They need to embrace the deep contradictions. They need to embrace the friendships. They need to embrace an understanding of home and family and a longing, as you pointed out, the hatred and the longing, existing. Somebody who is a true patriot senses themselves, sees the logic for the country to which they belong, and yet longs all their life to go back to the other place. And as Anchal pointed out, it's like a kind of anchor, something that holds you, something that gives you a past to belong to. And one of the things that partition did was to arbitrarily cut off that past and that anchor from so many people. And in some ways, I think what's very exciting about what is happening today and what we see in the kind of work that all of you are doing is this would not have happened, let's say 25, 30 years ago. you yourselves have located it from the 50th anniversary onwards. But there comes a moment in our histories when certain kinds of explorations become important, become possible, and become almost inevitable. And that moment, I think, started to come 20, 25 years ago when people like Ritu Menon and I and others started to enter this terrain. But the directions in which you have taken it, where the internet and your friendships and perhaps the fact that many of you can so easily be world citizens are enabling connections of the kind that were really, really difficult for people like us to make. And those connections and what you get from them and what you bring to them will offer us very, very interesting ways for the future. And finally, I just want to give you a little story from a women's conference that took place in Lahore I think it was around 2005 or thereabouts. I can't remember the exact date. Hamida might remember it. It was a South Asian conference. And that conference happened, I think the 30th anniversary of the formation of Bangladesh happened at the time when we were in that conference. And the Bangladeshi feminists who were there were in the conference, and the Pakistani women, the Pakistani feminists, dedicated that whole day to Bangladesh and spoke about the apology that they, as feminists, wanted to make, which the state was not prepared to make. And therefore, they apologized to their Bangladeshi sisters through words, through music, through solidarity, through holding of hands. And it was the most moving, the most beautiful, the most meaningful thing that I have ever seen. And you have all pointed out the imperatives of the state to constrain memory within certain bounds and not let it get out of that, and the people's imperative to actually look at memory in its multiple, contradictory, paradoxical, multi-layered formations. And here is an initiative made by people by women, where the memory of which those women bring to their sisters in Bangladesh is of a very different nature from what the Pakistani state would have brought. And in making that act of solidarity, they created a path for the future, which is what I think you're also doing. Thank you, and thanks for listening. Thanks for speaking.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Urvashi. It's really wonderful to have you here and wonderful to hear your closing remarks. I just posted in chat that what you said really forms the basis of a really well-considered little op-ed that we need to get out. And that's what we're trying to do with Sapan, is to, like we discussed, I wouldn't call it a counter narrative. We are forging our own narrative. And that's what Ananya and Anchal and Anam are doing. And what people like, Priyanka and our young researchers like Vishal, and, it's not just women, also men are involved. So we'll close here.